What's up, and welcome to Chapter 30 of Traditions and Encounters, the Making of Industrial Society. Industrialization really changed how the world works today, and it started because of many reasons. One of them was coal. Coal was critical to the early industrialization of nations such as Britain. People shifted from using wood to using coal because of deforestation. Too many trees were being cut down, and people needed a new fuel source that could be easily mined. And in places like Britain, there were abundant and accessible coal reserves. A second reason was overseas colonies. Overseas colonies provided raw materials to their mother nations. For example, plantations in the Americas provided sugar and cotton, which was good for making rum and textiles. After they were colonized, colonies also became markets for their mother nations, so the United States as a colony was a market for British manufactured goods. A third reason was the demand for cheap cotton, and it was spurred by the mechanization of the cotton industry. Cotton used to be processed by hand, but after the Industrial Revolution, new machines made cotton processing a lot faster, easier, and more efficient, and people wanted more of it. A fourth reason was James Watt's steam engine, and this was revolutionary because it helped machines to have a lot more power. This steam engine burned coal, which drove a piston and turned a wheel, and it helped to increase productivity and lower prices in the manufacturing processes. A fifth reason was iron and steel. So these were important industries, and they were continually being refined. So coke was purified coal, and it replaced charcoal as a principal fuel. So in these big factories where they made steel, they use coal instead to help power these big power plants. Also, the Bessemer press was also the Bessemer converter, and it was a new method that made cheaper, stronger steel from iron. And using this steel, new cities could pop up with these stronger buildings. A sixth reason was the transportation revolution. It improved with steam engines and improved steel, and suddenly people could use these steel rails to lay down tracks all across their country, and after the steam-powered locomotive came into market, people could travel by train. So this is emergence of the train as well. On the seas, instead of wind sails, people began to use steamships to navigate throughout the oceans and seas. It was a lot more powerful and more controllable. And railroads and steamships really lowered transportation costs and created dense transportation networks. So now it was easier and cheaper to ship goods across places, but it was also easier to travel as well. Another reason for industrialization was the factory system. The factory system replaced the old putting out system where individual families would sort of make goods and put them out. Factory system required a division of labor, so there were workers who performed a single task and usually a supervisor on top who managed everyone. And workers had to be really coordinated, disciplined, and were often closely supervised to ensure they were doing a good job. As a result of these factories, working conditions became a lot more harsh. So workers lost status because they weren't skilled, they were just earning a wage. They didn't really have a skill such as shoemaking. They just had one job, like putting glue on the shoes. And this harsh work discipline, fast pace of work also led to many accidents, and some social problems would arise from this. Social problems included industrial protest. So the Luddites were workers who actually struck against the mills and destroyed machines, and some of them were hung as a result of their movement. Industrialization really started in Western Europe, especially Britain. So the British had an industrial monopoly because they didn't really want their industrial trade secrets going to other places or foreign workers coming in. Napoleon and France abolished trade barriers in Western Europe to make trade a lot easier during this time period, and also dismantled guilds, which were like organizations of certain crafts, such as shoemakers or blacksmiths. Belgium and France soon followed, and after Otto von Bismarck united the Germans, he sponsored heavy industry, arms, and shipping, basically a buildup of a new military. North America was after Europe, and big part of why they were after Europe was because they had few labors and little capital. They weren't as developed as Europe, and so it took some time for them to get going. But British craftsmen took their cotton textile secrets to New England in the 1820s, and soon America was able to build up heavy iron and steel industries, and rail networks integrated the rest of the United States following that. Industrial capitalism is basically mass production provided cheaper goods, so when you produce things in a larger quantity, it's often easier to make each unit cost a lot cheaper. So Eli Whitney created interchangeable parts mass production based on interchangeable parts. Basically, each part of a certain product could be interchanged if it was like broken, and this was for firearms, so guns. And later, Henry Ford actually used this method and the assembly line to speed up automobile production. Industrialization was expensive, and it required a large capital investment, so usually large-scale corporations and investors, kind of like joint stock companies, came together. Soon after, monopolies, trusts, and cartels came up, and there were competitive associations. Monopoly, kind of like the game, is when you own the total industry. Basically, you don't have any competitors. So different people, industry giants, they started to own certain parts of their industry. For example, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil Company, and he used vertical organization, basically buying each step of the production process. So first he bought the oil fields, then the railroad lines, and finally the oil refinery. So he controlled every part of the production process. Horizontal integration was also popularized, also known as a cartel. And horizontal integration basically meant buying all your competitors. So John D. Rockefeller was also really known for horizontal integration. He bought all the smaller oil companies and consolidated them into his trust, the Standard Oil Company. Industrial society. There were many fruits of industry or effects. Basically, one was population growth. When cities started to industrialize, industrialization started to raise the material standards of living and allowed people to have more goods than they had before. As a result, populations of Europe and America also rose because there were more resources for everyone. Better diets and improved sanitation to some extent also reduced the death rate of adults and children and helped increase the overall population. Demographics changed as well, so declining birth rate also contributed to a declining mortality as well. And some people started to use contraception or voluntary birth control. Before, it was kind of taboo as a result of many religions, but after this time, many people started to experience a social change and started to use it. Urbanization and migration. Industrialization really grew around cities, and people from the countryside started to want to move to these urban centers for a new way of life. But the urban areas didn't come without their problems. So, for example, many places in the city were really cramped. The houses were bad. The air was bad because of so much waste going around. And the water supply was not always there because of the huge population density and everyone requiring water. To counter this, governments politically, they passed building codes and built sewer systems to try to manage this new influx of people. A transcontinental migration occurred as well. So Europeans went across the ocean to North and South America, and other instances of migration included the Irish potato famine, in which Irish people lost all their potato crops basically and had to come over to America for a new chance at life, and anti-Semitism, which was persecution of Jews in Russia. People really wanted a new chance in the land of opportunity, America, and that's really how America grew as well. Industry and society, a new social hierarchy sort of formed. It wasn't just always kings and their servants anymore. At the top now were captains of industry. They were a new aristocracy of wealth. So John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, who started a steel plant, these sort of business owners, the CEOs, started to manage all the wealth for a lot of people. The middle class were the managers, accountants, other professionals. These were people who worked in the administrative zones for these captains of industry, kind of like their secretaries. These were also known as white-collar workers. And then at the bottom was the working class. These were the blue-collar workers. They were unskilled, poorly paid, and vulnerable to whatever the captains of industry wanted. They were really like the workers of the factory and such. The industrial family also evolved as well. So there was a sharp distinction between work and family life. Back in the day when you worked on the farm, family life was kind of always together because you always worked on your land. But with industrialization, long hours became common. Family members also led increasingly separate lives because of working in factories and leaving home to find wages. Men during this time, socially, patriarchy grew stronger. They increased stature and responsibility. They had to kind of be the head of the household to earn the primary wage in factories. And many times they were the sole providers of the family. But this also helped to have some more self-improvement, discipline, and work ethic for men as well. So it could be argued that industrialization really helped mold men to become better people as well. Outside of work, though, some men started to resist work discipline, and they had this culture of going to bars, sports, gambling, basically outlets away from the stresses of normal work. Opportunities for women went down during this time of industrialization. Working women could not really bring children to mines or factories, and so they had to stay home and raise the children, and as a result, they had less freedoms, of course. But women were able to be domestic servants for other people, usually the wealthy people, and this helped them to earn some income. Children, however, were forced to contribute to the family in order to support their living conditions and everything. And as a result, many children couldn't get their education, so this is sort of a negative side of industrialization. It was so bad that primary education became mandatory in England, and Parliament started to regulate child labor to try to encourage kids to be in school more, as we have today. As a response to all this industrialization came the socialist challenge. So utopian socialists wanted to establish model communities based on the principle of equality, where there wouldn't be captains of industries and their workers. Everyone would be equal. And two of these was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they were 19th century socialists. They thought that these utopian socialists were unrealistic and unproductive. You couldn't really just go back to the beginning of Earth and the equality there again. It just wasn't possible. But they also critiqued industrial capitalism because it didn't allow really competition between different businesses, and it exploited the working class, the factory workers. And they also thought the state were all tools that the capitalist class used to maintain their power. So they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. It claimed many things, but ultimately it wanted dictatorship of the proletariat, the working class, who would destroy capitalism. And after they destroyed capitalism, they would have a communist government or a communist revolution where everyone would be fair. And once communism helped to evenly distribute the wealth, socialism would follow, a fair, just, and egalitarian society, because if communism really worked as it should, nobody would really care much for material goods because everybody was equal again. These ideas dominated Europe, and they were kind of the counter to democratic movements around the world at this time. Social reform also came through legislative measures. Governments started to regulate hours and restrict work for women and children to sort of make the family atmosphere better. And under Bismarck, Germany provided medical insurance and social security, which is the start of these kind of programs that we have in America today. These really provided a safety net for people in case they hit hard times. Trade unions also formed to represent the proletariats, the industrial workers. They faced stiff competition from the factory owners and governments, but that ultimately they really wanted to help employers be more responsible for their workers' needs, and it also helped avert violence in some cases. Global effects of industrialization. Industrialization spread beyond Europe and North America. It went to places like Russia, where the Tsar government really promoted it. They built thousands of miles of railroads to connect Russia. Of course, Russia is really big. One was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, basically linking both ends of Russia, big commercial line. Also, they reformed commercial law to help industries and steamship companies from unfair foreign competition. They promoted nautical and engineering schools to facilitate trade. And Russia itself also produced half the world's oil, so they were a big contributor of oil during this time, and iron and armaments. And this is kind of the rise of Russia as well. In Japan, so Asian countries now, they also had big industrialization. The government really liked it. The government hired thousands of foreign experts on industrialization to create these modern industries. They also created schools, institutes, and universities to help teach the tricks of the trade of industrialization. Some businesses were government-owned and some were private. And Japan was the most industrialized nation in Asia by 1900, and that would contribute to their rise after 1900 as well. International division of labor. There was a new demand for raw materials. Non-industrialized societies became suppliers of raw materials. If you weren't industrialized, most cases, you unfortunately were suppliers to industrialized nations, so you were kind of subordinate to them. And this is bad because many nations became colonies and they didn't have self-determination. So India was one. They provided cotton for Britain. Egypt provided rubber. Brazil and other places in Africa were also colonies and raw material suppliers. Ultimately, the biggest takeaway is that economic dependency formed. It was more common in other countries. Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia especially became subservient to their European, generally colony mother nation rulers. Foreign investors owned and controlled many plantations and productions and took rights out of the natives. And a free trade policy favored foreign products over domestic, because if foreign trade is cheaper than domestic trade, of course you're going to choose the foreign trade. That's kind of why we have a lot of products from places such as China and the rest of Asia today, because they have cheaper wages and can produce cheaper goods than America. Ultimately, the world was divided into producers and consumers, and the modern economy as we know it really formed out of industrialization. So in conclusion, this has been Chapter 30 of Traditions and Encounters, the Making of Industrial Society and Industrialization. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.